About 10 years ago, in the late 90s, Microsoft faced a threat that they had never seen before. You see, they had spent the last 20 years looking to find ways to dominate the personal computer, and they had basically pummeled the heck out of guys like Netscape and IBM and Apple and really dominated their space. And then they woke up one day and realized that they were about to become irrelevant. And the thing that was going to make them irrelevant was this thing right here. You see, in the fall of 2000, Sony was getting set to launch the PlayStation 2. Show of hands, how many of you have a PlayStation 2? And yes, you see, this frightens Microsoft tremendously, right? So they decided to do something completely different. They went out and hired a group of people who loved to play video games. It turns out that Microsoft also knew nothing about gaming. They knew everything about what people did in their offices, like what we do when we go back to our cubicles. But they knew nothing about what people did in their homes and how they spent time in their living rooms. So they got together a group of folks who loved to play video games. And I mean loved to play video games. These guys, they were 35 years old going on 13. And they loved to spend time killing things and fighting each other. They, more than anything else, they just love to kick ass, right? So when they made a video game console, they made something that was for them, right? This was not going to be some PlayStation thing where you could wander through a magical fairyland and pick up fancy jewels and rescue the fairy princess with your buddy Mario. This was going to be something that you could use to kill people, okay? And it had a very focused and directed message about what it was all about. And what they did was they made a game console that was for themselves. And they named it the Xbox. And when they launched it in the fall of 2001, it was an overnight sensation. They launched it with a game called Halo, which went on to become an iconic video game brand beyond anything that had been seen on the computer before. They sold 24 million units worldwide. iPod was launched in the fall of 2001 and immediately took off. They sold 50 million iPods by 2006. Right? It was a huge success. And they said, we can go after this too. So they took that same team, the same managers, the same developers, the same designers, and they said, now we want you to go after this thing. Now we want you to destroy this. And so very quickly the team worked and they launched something called Zune. How many of you have a Zune? Show of hands. Anybody? They sold 2 million Zunes in the first 18 months. In that same time, 84 million iPods were sold. It's just an unfortunate thing. One reviewer, when describing the installation process of the Zune, said it was about as pleasurable as having an airbag launch in your face. Just a nasty product. And looking at this was something that we at Jump were fascinated by. Because here was the same team, the same company, the same time schedule, and the same competitive situation, where in one situation they had dramatically transformed the market and did something amazing, and in the other they did something amazingly poorly. And we wanted to figure out what that difference was. And we spent time up in Redmond, Washington, and we talked to the folks who worked on this. And over we heard the same story. And it came down to one thing, one driving difference between Xbox and Zune that made one the all-time killer and one the all-time flop. And it came down to who they were designing it for. We heard over and over people saying things like, the biggest challenge with Zune was trying to figure out who we were building it for. With Xbox, we knew those guys. Hell, we were those guys. And with Zune, we didn't know what we were doing. But what we're finding is that over and over again, the #1 differentiator in the mix is that sense of empathy. And by empathy, I don't mean lovey-doveyness, and I don't mean touchy-feeliness. What I mean by empathy is the ability that every one of us has, that every one of us is wired with from the day we're born, which is the ability to step outside of ourselves and put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And if you can do that, you pick up on a lot of information that you otherwise didn't know. And that's what it means for an individual. For a company, it means stepping outside of your company. It means stepping outside of your building and stepping out into the world and bringing that outside world into you so that you have an intuitive understanding of what's going on in the world. Right? Because when we spend time with clients, we notice that there are some companies that we work with that do incredibly well very quickly. And there are some companies that struggle. And the ones that do incredibly well have that innate sense of empathy. When you walk into Harley-Davidson, the sign at the front of the building says, Harley-Davidson motorcycle parking only, no cages allowed. Anyone know what a cage is? Just shout it out. It's a car, right? Because if you ride a motorcycle, you know that a car is a cage. It's something that locks you in from the outside world, that prevents you from experiencing the world in all of its freedom and joy. And if you drove in a rented Taurus from the airport, welcome to Harley-Davidson, but parking's in the back. If any of you have been to Nike's campuses in Beaverton, Oregon, it looks a lot like a college campus with all the boring buildings removed. Like, it's just gymnasiums, one after the other, and a little bit of offices. And there's a running track that goes around the entire campus. And every building is named after a different sports star. So they have the Tiger Woods Center, and the Michael Jordan Center, and the Mia Hamm Center. And the Mia Hamm Center is themed around the entire notion of soccer. Sorry, not soccer, football, because that's what most of the world calls it. And so this football-themed building is where most of the people who work on football shoes and equipment live. And every wing is not named, you know, like Wing B or Wing C. Wings are named after stadiums like Maracana and Wembley. So people live in the stadiums that they're trying to emulate. And if you have a cubicle, your cubicle isn't 23D, you know, on an aisle. You live on aisles named after great football players. So you might be at, you know, Maradona 13. Named after Diego Maradona. So every day you get a constant little reminder that says, this is why we're in business, ladies and gentlemen. What can you do to create this sense of widespread empathy? And we said, well, one of the first things that tips us off is language. Language tells you how you view the world. The words you use explain how you see the world. For instance, you know, there's the whole issue of inheritance tax, and whether you call the inheritance tax the estate tax or the death tax tells you a lot about how you see the inheritance tax, right? So your language tells you how you see the world. And we saw it inside of companies when we visited them. For example, take this picture right here. This is a picture of the front of a car. It's a big plastic thing, the wall in front, which the steering wheel screws into, and it's got the radio and the air conditioning on it. Anyone know what this thing is called? Dashboard, that's right, exactly. You're all wrong. In fact, the answer is an instrument panel. If you actually work for a car company, this is called an IP, right? Because a dashboard apparently is something old, and now we're on to instrument panels. And that word that they use internally inside car companies is completely different from the word that human beings use. And so even in their language, they separate themselves from what ordinary folks on the street think about. They separate themselves from the folks who pay for their cars, for their I'll leave you with one last thing, which is people ask me about. Okay, so besides this book that you've got coming out, besides Wired to Care, if we wanted to read a book on innovation, what is the best book to read out there? And I always recommend one book. I have for years, and I think it is the best book on innovation that you could possibly read. Many of you have already read it. It's called How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. Right? Because Dale Carnegie was the world's first self-help guru. How many of you read this? Just show of hands. Right? So you all know the basic premise on some level. He said, if you want people to like you, here's the secret: like other people. Right? And if you want people to be interested in you, you should be genuinely interested in other people. So that, you know, if I'm at a party and Mark comes up to me and says, Mark, how's things going at Jump? Yeah, you guys are growing. Yeah, you've been doing a lot of work with General Mills. Yeah, the weather in California is kind of nice this time of year. When Mark walks away, I go, wow, that guy's a really interesting guy. Because we talked about everything I'm interested in, which is me. Right? And it's not just because I'm a selfish bastard, it's because I'm human, and if you are interested in other people, they will be interested in you. Right? Well, the same thing is true for companies, which is that if you reach outside of yourself, if you forget about everything that you are doing and start caring about their lives, you will notice that you have a rabid following of people just like me who can't wait to say goodbye to you all and get home and feed Maya another Cheerio.